This is the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. And now, Rebecca Larson.
From the Beauforts to Henry VII and Richard III, as well as the Pretenders, the history of England is strife with ups and downs. But the first Tudor king surely had his share of downs. Today, I invite author Nathen Amin to answer some of my burning questions. He'll explain what he believes happened to the princes in the Tower, and finally answer whether or not Henry VII was a usurper, and was he a miser? I'm Rebecca Larson, host of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast and owner of TudorsDynasty.com. Telling the stories of those who lived centuries before us is what I enjoy doing most. Whether it be a show on one subject or an interview with an author or historian, I'll bring you the tales of 16th century England. Before I get started today, I need to take a minute to thank Kara D. for becoming a patron since the last episode. Thank you, Kara. If you'd like to become a patron, you can do so by going to Patreon, that's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty, and click Become a Patron. For as little as $3 per month, you can show your support. Also, I am creating a free Tudor course for those who are interested. I've been blown away at the response since nearly 1,000 people have already emailed me to get signed up for this. If you're interested, you can email me at tutorsweekly@gmail.com. And as an added incentive, if you become a patron, you will get early access to the course, the VIP treatment, since you've been so kind to support me and my podcasts. The course is set to begin in January with great topics being covered. Stay tuned for more information. And with that, let's get on with the interview with Nathen. Nathen, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me, Rebecca.
Nathen, you are one of those people that I feel like I've known on social media for a lifetime, but we've never met in person. But you do seem like the kind of person that I'd like to sit down and talk history and share a beer with. So my curiosity about your interest in history is probably the most common question you're always asked is, what piqued your interest in history?
I tend to always answer this question, and it makes people laugh because I answer it with boredom. And what I mean by that is many people studied history perhaps through school onto university level. They seem to, be real history geeks in the nicest way from young children. I don't think I was quite that child myself. I wouldn't have said that I was a massive history geek as a child. If anything, it was probably geography and sports I loved. But where I'm from in South Wales, it's an area that's history everywhere where we turn. And the Welsh are always aware of their history. So I guess it's always been there in the background. But I got to my mid-20s and suddenly your social circle starts to dwindle as people perhaps, start to get married, have children, develop other interests. And I think you suddenly start to find your world shrinking a lot. And it was at that point that I started to look around for things that that interested me now as someone in my mid-20s, as opposed to carrying on the same interests I'd always had. I suppose you could say, in a really, almost like a elitist way, you've found yourself, I guess. And that's pretty much what happened. I started visiting the odd castles here and there in my spare time, checking out some RBs. And I think I'm somebody who naturally has quite an obsessive personality. As soon as something clicks in my mind, I'm all in. And that's slowly what happened with the history. I started to read one or two books on the Tudors specifically. And then when you're tying into being able to visit the actual locations where history happened, very quickly, you're starting to almost build a chain link by link. And 10 years later, I'm still here. I'm still trying to build that chain longer, because once you start, there's no stopping with this subject. There's always something to learn and discover. So the short answer rather there is boredom.
I love that answer. I think that is so great. It's very similar to me was when I was in school. History was never interesting to me, and I always blame that, unfortunately, on the teachers that I had, that maybe they didn't make it interesting for me, or maybe it was the subjects that we were taught I didn't find interesting. And once I found the Tudors, I'm the same as you. I'm all in now. It is an obsession. It's all I read. I work at a bookstore during the week, and people are constantly asking me, have you read this new book by so-and-so or this new book by so-and-so? And I go, no, haven't I told you I only read English history? Like, I don't veer from it. This is all I read.
I mean, the problem with it was almost something similar with myself, but I couldn't really blame the teacher in my school. It was more how the curriculum worked when I was 16, because I always enjoyed history. I enjoyed geography. The problem was when I started school, I was one of them kind of, those kids you just seem to know everything about a particular thing, and nobody knows why. And I was one of them with geography. At 11 years old, you could name me any country in the world, and I'll be able to tell you their capital city, their flag. I'd be able to draw you their flag. I was just, one of those kids who knew everything about geography and was known as that kid all through school. Now, when you get to 16 in the UK and you start to study your GCSEs, things have probably changed many times since I was at school. But that particular year, the choice came down to you could either go on to study history or you could study geography. You couldn't do both. And if you could have done both, I certainly would have done both of them. But it was a straight up choice, A or B. And I feel now I was perhaps pushed into doing geography by the school because I was known as this child who knew everything about geography. And I think, in hindsight, if I'd gone down the history route, then perhaps I would have gone on to study it heavily at A level and on to university and so on. So I've kind of taken the long path to going back to 16 years old and almost being able to make that choice again. And it's a shame because I liked history in school. I had great teachers. One teacher in particular, Mr. Knight, and he sadly passed away a couple of years after I left school. So it would have been great to have been able to have these conversations with him now, because he's one of those very excitable teachers. And I still feel a bit bad for myself almost, and for him that I dropped it at 16. So, it's almost like a school decision that was taken out of my hands. And that's one of my regrets, I think, when I look back to school. I wish they had let me take both of those subjects.
It makes you wonder how things would be different today if they had.
Exactly, yes. I mean, perhaps you would have ended up studying it at university and then moving on into an academic area. I mean, who knows how life would have turned out.
You had mentioned when we first started talking here that you are from Wales, and I'm very curious. Can you speak Welsh?
I can get by in Welsh. Wales is it's a fascinating one because people have this idea outside of Wales that Welsh is a dead language, nobody speaks it, and what's the point of it? But the truth is that 20% of Wales is first language Welsh. If you were to speak to my grandmother, for example, her natural inclination is to speak in Welsh, to think in Welsh. It's a living language for her every day. And where I grew up in South Wales, if you were to go into a shop in any of the local villages, they're going to start speaking to you in Welsh automatically. It's their language, no different to how English in England, French in France and so on. So this idea that people, no Welsh person can speak Welsh, which is often the stereotype you get, is wrong. And with that said, regards to myself, where I grew up, you have to know some degree of Welsh to get by. I mean, it's because you will go into a shop and people will start to speak to you in Welsh first off. So you almost learn it through osmosis kind of ways. So if I went into a shop, if my grandmother spoke to me in fluent Welsh, I would understand everything they're saying, but then respond in English. And the problem there is that a lot of the younger generations are in my age group, let's say people between 25 and 45, we seem to have turned more towards speaking English in a social situation. So you almost lose the practice of using the Welsh. So even though you understand it fluently, speaking it, it's like exercise. You start to lose a little bit of the confidence and so on. Whereas the generation below us, I think there's a real heavy push now to get them to use Welsh outside of work, outside of school, and in a social circle, so they're more confident and more comfortable using it every day. So it's a weird one that I can understand fluent Welsh, but I would respond in English. So I'm not sure where that would fit into the first language, the second language kind of scenarios.
Well, I would say it definitely must have helped you with your research on Henry Tudor.
It does, yes. I mean, with regards to understanding the Welsh language, that's a little bit more complicated because medieval Welsh, just like medieval English, is on a whole different level of modern comprehension. You have to be a student of medieval Welsh in itself rather than just being Welsh speaking. But it certainly does help with the mindset, at least, of being able to put yourself into that 15th century situation and try to understand what were the Welsh people of the day thinking, what was Henry thinking, whereas too often it's just been brushed under the carpet or just ignored when it's being looked at from an English aspect or even an American aspect or anybody studying the subject not Welsh, because you haven't been brought up in the Welsh mindset of looking at the world around you. So the language aspect, possibly it hasn't helped me too much, but certainly the mindset at least has, I think, or at least allowed me to give a fresh aspect to the study of Henry.
Well, and you said you were surrounded by all of these historic buildings and places in Wales. I'm curious, what was the first place in Wales that you visited that was attached to Henry?
It almost certainly would have been something like Pembroke Castle and so on as a child. The difference was, of course, I wouldn't have known that it would have been attached to Henry. It would have just been a local place we used to visit. There's a seaside town in South Wales called Tenby, and Tenby is quite well known in the UK for its beaches and its little shops and so on, and it's quite a popular seaside resort in the summer. So we visited there multiple times every summer as a child, and that would have been heavily associated with Henry and Jasper Tudor. In fact, Tenby was where both the Tudor uncle and nephew escaped from Wales in 1471 when they were being chased by the Yorkists. There's an argument that if they had not escaped from Tenby, they both would have been put to death at that time, because they were, rightly or wrongly, regarded as, potential, or Henry was, as a potential Lancastrian heir. And Edward IV was keen to mop up any rival claimants. And they escaped from Tenby in a small boat with, barely any time to spare, and escaped across to the sea. Now, every time I go to Tenby now, that is always the key thing I'm always aware of. Obviously, as a kid and as a teenager, I'm sure all I cared about was getting into the sea or getting onto the beach. But it's those kind of things now that it's given me a new respect and a new vantage point for my life when I go back home, because I'm learning new things about an area I'd always grown up on. So as a child, Tenby, for example, would have been this place we went to go to the sea with the family or down the beach. And then as you get a bit older, you go off Tenby a little bit. I think when I speak to all my friends, we all felt the same, that when you learn that you can go to the, to some of the Spanish places or some of the Cypriot places or the Greek places, Tenby all of a sudden doesn't seem that attractive when you're 18, 19 years old. You think it's boring, it's bland, the kind of place that's full of grandparents or families. Now, all of my friends now say with their own young children, they think Tenby is one of the best places in the world. They've almost rediscovered it as parents themselves. I am not a parent, but I have rediscovered my love for Tenby based on the history. So I'm normally, if anyone's ever in Tenby in the summer and you're walking past someone staring up at a medieval city wall, whilst everybody else is walking past me with their surfboards, that'll probably be me.
That would be me too. I think to be surrounded by that much history would just be awe-inspiring. I always say when I finally get to travel to England that the first thing is I'm just going to run up to an ancient building and touch it and start crying because it's so amazing what you have all around you. You're so fortunate.
It's quite a funny scenario. I mean, I live in York now, and I must have seen York Minster, one of the grandest buildings in the world, so many times, and I take it for granted. And I liken it. I'm sure the same could be said for somebody living in New York. They must walk past the Empire State Building, see the Statue of Liberty so often. It's just a thing. It's no longer, something that people come from all around the world to see. And sometimes I get that way in York. I take it for granted. And I brought a friend up last year, and he had no interest in history. It's just not something that phases him. And I was getting a bit frustrated because he just couldn't accept how wonderful the Minster was. It was just a building. And then later in the night, we may have had one or two beers, perhaps. And I took him right up to the Minster, up to it face to face, and I asked him to just look up. And, when you're that close, we can argue maybe the hops had put him in a more accepting state of mind, but he looked up and for the first time, you could see his mind click. Wow. And then came the questions. I don't understand how they built it. How did they build it? How did they conceive such a structure? And I could see it in his mind, and it felt brilliant to finally get, this is what teachers must go through almost on a day-to-day basis, when they can see something click in the mind of somebody that they're trying to, get hooked on a subject. And it was brilliant. And before we knew it, out came his phone. He started taking pictures. He wanted pictures of me with it and him with it. And it was such a happy moment for me just to see somebody just, their mind just click. So yeah, there is a danger, which you don't have, in that when you come over, you're straight away excited to see everything. In the same way that if I come over to America and I'm going to New York, my mind is feasting on everything I can see. Oh, look at that wonderful tenement building. Look at that stair, fire escape. It's like the movies. I suppose it's same in reverse. And sometimes, yeah, you do take it for granted, and then other times, again, I guess it's just frame of mind. Sometimes you're in that frame of mind, ready to see, ready to take in everything that you're looking at. It's a prime example of that. Every time I go to Bosworth, and again, I've been there, conservative guess, 30 times at least. And every time I stop at the field where the real battle was fought. Now, I'm not somebody who's naturally inclined to, feel the atmosphere or be able to mentally transport myself back in time like some people can do when they walk in historic buildings. I'm just not built that way. But I always stop at that field I always spend a couple of minutes just looking across what is just a barren field. It could be a field same as millions of fields all around the world. That there's no real distinguishing features. It's just a field. But I cannot stop myself from stopping there every a couple of minutes every time I go there, just because I know what happened there. I just know this is a famous field. And you do sometimes see the cars going past, and they must be wondering, what is this guy doing? He's just standing looking over a hedge at a field.
I'm seeing it. There's a common theme here, Nathen.
Yeah.
You standing and staring at things awkwardly, maybe.
But the funny thing about this is that it's not. I mean, this is where you learn more about history, and it's no longer. You know, if I go to London, I'm not interested in Westminster Abbey. I'm not interested in St Paul's Cathedral. It could be some very, very small piece of brickwork up some side alleyway that people just don't know it's there, because you start to, once you've ticked off all of the big things on your list and you've seen them multiple times, you really start to scrape the barrel for the connections. And I think that's where I am at the moment, where I get more excited about these really small, tenuous links to the figures we're interested in than I would be over something, significant. And that's where I take most joy in. I really like trying to find these small links. I'm currently reading Nicola Tallis's book on Margaret Beaufort, and I consider myself someone who knows quite a lot of these small, tenuous, windows or houses of the various Tudors. And I didn't realise that a couple of miles away from where my parents-in-law live in Cambridgeshire, there's actually a church that's got a little bit of stained glass that's supposedly said to be Margaret Beaufort. And I couldn't believe I didn't know this, because how have I missed this when it's a couple of miles away from somewhere I go quite regularly? So I'm really excited to get back down there soon, just to go see this little piece of stained glass. And it's those kind of things now that are the exciting things for me.
Yeah, I'm excited to read her book as well, but let's not forget you did write House of Beaufort. So you have a little bit of knowledge on this area, and it's been a pretty good selling book for you as well, hasn't it?
Yes, done better than I expected. It's just about to go through another print run. So the print runs the publishers are putting through, it's still selling out those print runs, so they keep on doing another one, which is always a good problem to have.
That's amazing. And other than obviously you did a great job writing it, but what do you think it is that is drawing people to that topic?
This might sound like a negative, but it's not meant to be. It's the market at the moment is very saturated with books. When I first started coming into this period, about 2010, so a decade ago, it was very difficult to find information. The two Henry VII books I was able to get hold of at that point, of three. One was written in 1997, one was written in 1985, and the other was written in 1971. Since that time, in the last 10 years, I think there's been at least 6 or 7 books on Henry VII alone. And that has spread elsewhere. Richard III, numerous books. Anne Boleyn, numerous books. Elizabeth I, etc. And I think people, there's obviously a market out there, but you start, just as we as authors do, you start to spread out looking for more information about the people in these books. I enjoy reading about Henry VII, but I can't keep on reading multiple books on him in a row. You need to start looking around. And that's pretty much, I think the reader is the same as the author here, in that they want to learn more about the background figures in all these books. Hence why we now have the Beauforts coming through, the Yorks coming through, later on the Seymours coming through, for example, with yourself. People, you need to learn more about the figures around the central characters. It puts everything into context. Nothing occurs in isolation. So you can't know Henry VII without knowing the Beauforts. You can't know Henry VIII without knowing Henry VII. Everything needs context. I think that's where the Beauforts have worked for me personally. That's where the Yorks are working for Matt Lewis. It's where, the Seymours work for you, the Brandons work for Sarah Bryson, and so on.
Yeah, it's, one of the things that I think about with the Beauforts is that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everybody should know this, is the Beaufort line is where Henry VII gets the usurper title, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I did recently listen to your podcast with Matt Lewis, and this is where we are going to buck the trend. He's 100% correct in what he says about Henry Tudor. One of the biggest usurpers in the history of England and thereafter Britain. He is the usurper. And that is, he took the throne by power, by conquest. If you want to go down the line of who had more or less right, I think there is a good argument for more people than him at the time having this so-called right to the throne. But the reality is he won it by conquest. And also history, the kings really are, yes, there's the whole idea of right and who's the rightful king, but they are just the most powerful men in that position at that particular time. And right and claim helped people get their mind around that back then, but it still did always come down to who was more powerful, going back to William the Conqueror and before that. So yes, Henry VII definitely is a usurper, and he was able to usurp that throne by using, or at least people being aware of, his Beaufort background.
So now that I know that you listened to the last podcast with Matthew Lewis, now I have to ask you the same question that I asked him was, who was responsible for the princes in the tower? Did Richard kill him? Was Henry VII responsible? And then we always have was it Margaret Beaufort? I'd love your take on it.
Richard III.
That's it.
The problem with this is that it's an unanswerable question. And that's the first thing everybody needs to acknowledge coming to the subject. So when I say Richard III, and I'm claiming to be definitive, that's a wrong stance to take. Same as anyone who is adamant to his Margaret Beaufort or Henry Tudor or whoever, they are not giving the subject the respect it deserves, or history the respect it deserves, by not willing to at least acknowledge that we are not going to know. It's coming down to a hunch based on everything you've read, and none of us are comprehensively read on the subject because there's so much parts of this history that are either unknowable or have yet to be discovered. Chronicles yet to be discovered, or perhaps letters still in certain archives that have yet to be discovered. So, with that in mind, if I was pressed for an answer based on everything I've read, based on my ideas of the time, I would say Richard III was responsible, but I can't prove that any more than somebody can disprove it. It is just a hunch. I came across a quote a couple of years ago from an eminent historian called G.M. Trevelyan. I think he was quite a really well-known historian in the early 20th century. And he prefaced one of his biographies with the quote, "History, in fact, is a matter of rough guessing from all the available facts." And I think that sums the Princes in the Tower up very, very well. It is and has to remain a matter of rough guessing based on what we know. Matt's rough guess is that the princes survived. I find that unlikely, as he knows. And to the contrary, I, from my rough guessing, think Richard III was responsible, but it is still just all a rough guess based on what we know. And anyone who says they know the answer and it's this person and everybody else is wrong, sorry, but they're the ones who are wrong in this, or in this matter. At least until we have a definitive smoking gun, which we're not going to get.
Right. And, and there is something to be said that, for all we know, they died of natural causes, or one of them may have fled, which then leads me, of course, to the Pretenders, which is something that you are writing about right now.
Yeah. I mean, just go back one step. I mean, with regards to the princes in the Tower and them being killed, the one thing people often seem to not look at is we're looking for these big masterminds: Margaret Beaufort, Richard III, Henry Tudor, Buckingham. There would have been hundreds of men in London at that time who would have benefited from the prince's death. And what I mean by that is, if we take Buckingham, for example, he would have been in charge of a household. And that household at that time would have been the household of a duke. If he became king, then that household would have become a king's household. More money, more payments, more chances, more opportunities. No one's looked at the fact that some unknown servant, household officer, somebody whose name we will never know, took it upon themselves to do this in the hope that they would get their master a higher office so that they themselves could rise with him. I think that is definitely a possibility. We will do this so our master becomes king, we get more money, more chances. That certainly could have happened. So we're looking for this well-known mastermind behind the case. No different to people who studied Jack the Ripper, who were looking for a policeman or a famous surgeon, or even Lewis Carroll, famous writers, when the reality is it almost likely would have been some unknown whose name we'll never know. And I think that's something that people don't look at with the Princes of the Tower. They're too keen to find the mastermind, the famous mastermind.
Is that what led to you and your most recent book?
Yes. I mean, the books that I've written so far have always been books that I want to read, and no one's written them before. I'm looking to advance my own knowledge, and then you realize the book that you need is not there. You can't buy it. It's not been written. So you start to look into the subject yourself and put together your own research, which, luckily I am in a position to then be able to share with other people. People have written about the Pretenders before. There's been numerous books on Lambert Simnel, Perkin Warbeck, but never together. Their stories never been told in one book. And when the books have been written separately, they're taking away the context of Henry VII's life and his involvement in this. These books and the stories of the Pretenders are often from their viewpoint, and with the big Princes in the Tower question above it. What was Henry up to at this time? How did their appearance affect Henry's reign? How did he battle them? So I wanted to know the story as much from Henry's viewpoint as Simnel and Warbeck's. And without getting bogged down or distracted by the Princes in the Tower. I obviously cover in my book whether or not I think they were the Princes in the Tower, but that's not really the point of the book. The book is to cover the 15-year period from 1483 to 1500, and just writing about what happened and how each principal character in this story, including Henry VII, how they actually lived those years, because it was a fascinating time, a tumultuous time. There were repeated invasions of England. There was a lot of foreign enemies of England manoeuvring around. There were, marriage treaties made, broken, and there was two battles on English soil after Bosworth, and it all has to be, again, wrapped into the context of one continuous stretch of time, not just this is Bosworth, that finished, this is now Simnel, that finished, and this is now Warbeck, that finished. They've always been written as separate books. So I'm looking to put it all together, and hopefully I've created something that will be of interest anyway.
It's such a fascinating time in English history, and I've always wondered what it was like for Elizabeth of York during that time. It was such a tough beginning part of a reign for the first Tudor king, and people always talk about how Henry was so paranoid, and I want to look at his wife, at Elizabeth, and I always wonder what she thought during this time when Perkin Warbeck was claiming to be her brother. Like, those are the things that I think about so often.
I mean, we're back to the age-old problem of we just don't have enough information to know what her voice was. So we're back to rough guessing. And the problem here with Elizabeth is that all of our answers are going to be tinged with our own bias. So if you're somebody who thinks relatively positively about Henry VII, like I do, you're almost looking for Elizabeth to be, on Henry's side, or, you try and dismiss the worries and so on. Everybody's biased and nobody can help those feelings. Similar if you are a very anti Henry VII person, perhaps more pro-Richard, then you're also then going to be looking at, Elizabeth's been written out of history by Henry and so on. And the truth is, either way, we just don't know. We know nothing about her thoughts on this process, so we can only speculate. For my understanding of things and my reading of things is, I think she must have accepted that her brothers died in 1483. Now, whether she deep down believed that, I don't think she knew that, because not many people seem to have known what really happened. That enabled her to just get on with life. Yes, there's somebody claiming to be Perkin Warbeck, but Henry's agents and Henry's spies certainly had convincing evidence that he was nothing other than a fraud. If she just bought into that, she's been married by that point for 5 or 6 years. She's got several children. She is as Tudor by that point as any of them. Her entire future is wrapped up in Henry's survival for her children. So if we break it down to her just accepting her brothers are dead and this is now her family, then there's no reason for her to have spoken out, for her to have been concerned, and so on. I mean, we've got to remember that Elizabeth, there's no real reason why Elizabeth, yes, the princes in the tower were her brothers by blood, obviously, and she would have known them, but she would not have been closer to them necessarily than she would have been to her own children, in that she may not have known them that well, her brothers. She would have spent different times at different households growing up. She was older than them. So if we take it that she accepted that they died in 1483, there's nothing for her to worry about. And that's ultimately, I think, my reading of the entire situation. She doesn't act out in any way. We do have some letters of her that survive, so she's not completely voiceless. But again, there's nothing that contradicts the official line that they were frauds. And yes, the impulse is always to look for reasons and try to be cynical about why this is. But sometimes the boring answer is the answer. And that's the difficulty with history sometimes, is that we're always looking for the controversy. We're always looking for the conspiracy, the intrigue. Everything needs to be explained. And sometimes perhaps the simple answer is the right one.
Okay, so now I have a good one for you here. Why do you think everybody wants to call Henry VII a miser?
Because they don't know their history. Same why people call Richard III, an evil monster, because simple history through the ages has lasted. It's myth building. I know we always get this idea that the Tudors have completely blackened Richard's name, so everything they've said about Richard is a lie. I think certainly lots of aspects have been exaggerated, but the counter argument almost always goes that by comparison, everything about Henry VII that's lasted wasn't rewritten after his death. And that's nonsense. It clearly has been, he has also been misrepresented across time. And the miser aspect is one of them. Henry VII certainly wasn't miserly. He was avaricious. He definitely accumulated money, unlike any king of England before him. And he certainly got greedy in the last decade of his reign. But greed and miserness are two completely different qualities. And what I mean by that is Henry accumulated as much money as he could. And when you put that into the context of the time, which again is a key aspect of my book, and the threats he was facing, it's completely and utterly understandable why he acted as he did. Everything can be explained. Again, nothing happens without context or in a vacuum. So he tried to get as much money as he could for the security of his crown and his family. He or his men under him, Empson and Dudley, went to great lengths to accumulate that money, and it made him unpopular at the end of his reign. But he was still spending vast amounts of money. He never stopped spending. And almost all of the money that came into the treasury, just as much of it went out. Henry loved to spend money on jewelry. He loved to spend money on gold. So many payments of him just offering money to people for strawberries, for singing him songs, for reading him poetry. He built Richmond Palace, which at that time in England was possibly the grandest palace ever built. Anyone who's been to Westminster Abbey and has seen where he's been buried, that is not the action of a miser. A miser is Ebenezer Scrooge. The one thing Henry VII was not was a Scrooge, in the way that he kept his money and wouldn't spend a penny. So the miser thing is just wrong. It needs to be dismissed. It needs to be gotten rid of. And the frustrating thing for me is seeing Ricardians levelling these accusations at Henry VII without the self-awareness that the thing that's drawn them to the study of Richard III is the same lies put up, against him. You can't almost have it both ways. You need to sometimes be fair to both sides in this. And, I'm sure that's the same across history and even across the reign of the Tudors with other aspects. I mean, I'm not too hot myself on the whole Anne Boleyn topic, but I'm sure she has her lovers and her haters, some who are perhaps more pro Catherine Aragon and so on. And it's something you need to be, if you are trying to create an argument for the person that you, for lack of a better word, like, then you can't then use the same tactics that are being used against you against the other topic. And that's it really with regards to the miser thing. I think people need to put that to the side, and if you're going to use a word against Henry VII, it's going to be avaricious. At least get the word right.
Thank you for clarifying that, because that's one that I often hear. It's similar to how everybody always says Thomas Seymour was a cad, and maybe not that similar, kind of, but it always gets me worked up.
I mean, there's a great. We live in an age at the moment that's very anti-expertism. The experts don't know everything. We know better, and that's almost in general never true. People who have studied something their entire lives will simply know more. And what we've got at the moment is the University of Winchester over the last 5 or 6 years have put together something they call the Tudor Chamber Books. So they've been going through, led by Dr. Sean Cunningham, who for me is probably the greatest. Him and Dr. Stephen Gunn are probably the greatest experts at the moment on Henry VII living, together with Dr. James Ross, Dr. Samantha Harper, these great academic experts on the Tudors and Henry VII. They've put together this analysis of all of the chamber books of Henry VII. So everything that was spent from his personal privy purse was written down in these accounts, and they've gone through them, and I think they're going to be releasing a lot of their findings next year. And what's interesting for me is that, having spoken to almost all of them, they've come away with quite positive thoughts on Henry VII. They've really got down to the real nitty gritty of his reign, of the man himself, from the payments he's making on a day-to-day basis. And generally speaking, they've come away with a positive outlook of the man based on who he was paying money to, why he was paying money to them, and so on. And I think it's very easy to just dismiss all these experts, as, oh, well, they would say that, or just because they've studied it for 20 years doesn't mean they know more. When, yes, I think they generally do. And I think it's important not to just dismiss the viewpoint sometimes of people who aren't just doing this as a side hobby, but are doing this as a profession day in, day out. And I think the Tudor Books project, which, obviously I'm interested in the Henry VII part, but I think they're doing Henry VIII as well, up to 1520, is going to be a game changer. But only if people are willing to read that and be prepared to change their outlook on something, to truly educate themselves on a subject, which unfortunately some people are willing to do that, some people aren't. They're happy to live in their biased preconception of a topic. Mm-hmm. For example, calling Thomas Seymour a cad without studying the actual man, the history, and so on. I mean, you're going to know a lot more about him than I am, so I'm not going to sit there and make a judgment on somebody I just don't know that well.
Right. These Tudor books, man, I am looking forward to them, because you can really tell a lot about a person by what they spend their money on.
I mean, I'll give you one example. This idea has come down from history that Henry VII hated the Welsh. He hated his Welsh background, and so on, which, again, in my opinion, is complete and utter nonsense. I appreciate I have subconscious bias in that I don't want it to be true, so you always are looking for reasons to make it true. Same as everybody else studying history, they come with a preconceived bias, and that's not possible to rid ourselves of. But in his account books, there's regular payments that he's made to Welsh singers, Welsh harpists, and in particular on St. David's Day every March, he's made payments to the Welshmen in his employ so that they can have a feast to celebrate St. David's Day. The first English king we know of who's done that. Now, to me, that reads a man wanting to treat his men with money from his personal account to celebrate the patron saint of Wales's feast day. That reads to me, if you're a miser, you're not giving money to a bunch of servants to go and get drunk. and also why there's no reason, if there's no precedent, should we say, for him to do that. Richard III didn't, as far as we know, didn't give money to the Welshmen for St. David's Day. Edward IV didn't. Henry VI didn't. But Henry VII chose to do that. And I take that as an inference based on this actual tangible piece of evidence to suggest that he probably did have at least some sympathy with the Welsh background and wanted to reward the Welshmen in his employ. But again, if you're not going to read the chamber book, you're not going to analyse them, and you're not even willing to try and learn more to change your viewpoint on something, then it's almost, what's the point? What's the end game in this?
You definitely have some vast knowledge when it comes to Henry VII, and I so appreciate you being on the show today. And one of the things I'd like to do at the end of every episode is ask you a couple of questions. And the first one I want to ask you, Nathen, is what is one thing that the listeners might be surprised to know about you?
I suppose the obvious one is going to be, if anyone's seen a picture of me, I am mixed race. And the reason I say that is because it's quite hard to find other people writing about the Tudors who are of colour. So I suppose that really makes me stand out sometimes. The fact as well is I am from South Wales and from a working class background. So I tend to think I'm quite unusual in this world at the moment. There's not many people who look or sound like me out there writing about the Tudors. But if that gives me, a slight interest to other people, then brilliant, bring it on.
And I think I saw that you are on the list to be at the next Tudor Khan.
I am. That's the plan, yes. I've always been jealous of these bigger name historians who get these gigs in the US. And I don't think I've quite got my head around it at the moment, because it kind of is one of the last things on my author bucket list. Yes, I think if I stop and think that I'm going to America to give a talk, I think my mind might explode.
I love it. Well, my last question for you is, if I were to give you a time machine, Nathen, and you could safely return, where and when would you choose to go back to?
Now, I'm very, very happy that I listened to your podcast with Matt Lewis before this, because if you had asked me this out of the blue, I would have had a mind blank. And I think Matt touched on it when the obvious answer is always the Princess in the Tower, and to try and give an answer that is not obvious. So the one I'm going to give is going to be September 1484, and it's going to be in Brittany, because what happened at that point was Henry VII, or Henry Tudor at the time, had been in exile for 13 years, and he was at the Breton court whilst Richard III was on the throne. And Richard III was trying to get Henry captured and brought back to England. One would probably assume, I think, fairly, that he would have been put to death. He was this random potential Lancastrian exile who was a threat to Richard III, or a threat to any Yorkist king. Edward IV had tried for years to get hold of Henry and had failed. So Henry was in Brittany. And word reached Bishop John Morton in England that Richard had entered secret negotiations with the Bretons to hand over Henry to almost certain death. And somehow Bishop John Morton he managed to send word to Henry through a spy, telling him of his danger. And this is where I'd like to come in with my time machine, is that what Henry did at this point was he'd just been told by this spy, "You're about to be captured, mate, and you're about to be killed. What are you going to do?" And he grabbed 5 of his most trusted men he had with him at that time. So Henry was in exile with around 500 men. He grabbed 5 of them and told the Bretons he was off to meet one of his friends in the nearby countryside. You know, he's going with 5 people. There's no real reason to doubt why he would do that, especially when he's got his other, 495 men back in the court. But Henry, after about 5 miles of riding off to meet this imaginary friend, suddenly got off his horse, went into the forest, and put on the clothes of a servant. And then what he did was he rode with his 5 men straight for the French border. So at this time, France and Brittany were 2 different countries, or rather, Brittany was an independent duchy, separate to France. And he rode for the French border, determined to try and seek refuge in France. Now, the Bretons had found out about this, or they'd rather found out something was up. So they sent out a hunting party in pursuit of Henry. And what we've got here is some chase through the Breton forests of Henry and his 5 men literally riding for their lives, pursued by the Bretons, a Breton force who had been sent out to capture them so he could be taken back to England and almost certainly put to death. And I would have loved to have been on that. I mean, it sounds scary. You said that you can guarantee my safety with this time machine, but it would have been, just the sheer panic of this chase. It's almost something you can picture in the movies happening. It's a very Hollywood type scene through the night, through the forests, but then the exhilaration and the happiness when you finally cross that French border and you realise that you're safe. Because the chronicles tell us that Henry only made it across the French border with an hour to spare. So he got there just 1 hour ahead of his captors. And according to Polydor Virgil, he was wondrous glad to have been in France. And once in France, as we know, ultimately, history was written when he finally got hold of an army and was able to invade successfully England. So it's basically that horse chase, a very Hollywood type chase through the woods, pursued by your enemies, riding literally for your life.
Thank you for that unique answer.
I think no one will ever answer that question.
So your new book is going to be, can you tell everybody what the title of it is and when they can expect to start pre-ordering?
Yeah, the title, as things stand, we never say never when it comes to publishing, but the title is Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders, Warbeck, or rather Simnel, Warbeck, and Warwick. And it has been submitted now to the publisher as of 2 weeks ago. So it should be on bookshelves, real or virtual, next year in the summer at some time. But don't worry, I'll be promoting it quite a lot in the coming months. So you should see it pop up all over your social medias.
And once it comes out, I'll have to have you back on the show again.
Yes, definitely. Yes. I've talked for a couple of years about the Beauforts now, and I think it's time to give some of the other principal characters some love.
I think that's great. Nathen, where can everybody find you? What's your website, Facebook, Amazon, all that stuff?
My website is nathenamin.com. I always say I spelled my first name Nathan a little bit weird. There's an E in it, so keep an eye on that. So nathenamin.com, and then I'm on Twitter at Nathen Amin, and on my Facebook I am Nathen Amin Author, just in case anyone was a bit unsure about what it is I actually do.
And don't forget, though, you also have the Henry Tudor Society.
Yes, I do. I run the Henry Tudor Society Facebook page. So if you are over there and you post anything, I will be the person who will pick that up.
And of course, we want people to go out and buy all of your books. So not only did you have the House of Beaufort, what were the other titles that you have?
I've written 2 guidebooks. So the first is Tudor Wales. So it's essentially a guide of 40 places in Wales that are connected in some way to the Tudor dynasty. And I'm quite passionate really about people getting into Wales to view all of these things, because Tudor England gets all of the glory, they get all of the tourists, and there are some real hidden gems just a couple of hours away in Wales that people often overlook. So definitely, if you are coming over from America or you live in England, do come into Wales and check out what we got. And the other book is titled York Pubs, and I will let you guess what that one's about.
It will be the guide of where to drink all of the beer.
In York.
I love it. Nathen, thank you so much for being on the show today.
No problem. Thank you very much.
And that concludes this episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can find my show notes from this episode and how to become a patron at tudorsdynastypodcast.com. Don't want to miss an episode? Be sure to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Patreon, or Podbean. Intro and outro music called Folk Round by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com, Creative Commons license via filmmusic.io.
Thanks for checking out the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Read more on the blog at tudorsdynasty.com. Follow Tudors Dynasty on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Subscribe to Tudors Dynasty on iTunes. Thanks for listening.